It started with a phone call. Nothing unusual about that, except this one wasn't from a friend or a family member or even a scammer. It was from himself. He didn't recognize the number, just said unknown. But something made him pick it up. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe curiosity. He didn't expect what came next. As soon as he said hello, a voice, his own voice, rushed through the speaker. "Don't leave the house today." That's all it said. Then silence. Not even the chance to ask why. Not a click. Not a goodbye. Just gone. He sat there, phone still pressed to his ear, wondering if he'd misheard. But he hadn't. He was sure of it. The voice was his. Not similar. Asterisk his. Asterisk like hearing a recording of yourself. The tone, the pace, even the slight stutter he had when nervous. It was him. But older. Tired. Like the voice had seen something. Lived something. At first, he laughed. Out loud. Because what else do you do when you get a cryptic call from yourself? He even looked around the room as if a camera crew would pop out and yell, "Gotcha." But no one came. No punchline. Just the quiet hum of his apartment and the low buzz in his ears. He checked the call log. It was there, unknown. 7:03 a.m. He tapped it. No option to call back. He tried anyway. Nothing. Dead line. The air in the room felt different. Heavy somehow. He shook his head, placed the phone on the table, and poured his coffee like nothing had happened. Like the voice wasn't still echoing in his brain. Don't leave the house today. Why not? What would happen if he did? He had plans. Nothing special. Just errands. Groceries. Maybe stop by the bank. Nothing life-changing. But suddenly, it all felt dangerous. Absurd. He was being ridiculous, right? Was this what paranoia felt like? He picked up the phone again. No messages. No missed calls. No one texting to say, "Hey, just kidding." The clock on the wall ticked on like any normal day. But something had shifted. He felt it. He sat down and opened his laptop, trying to focus on work. But the words on the screen blurred. His mind wasn't on the project. It was on the voice. His own voice. And the fear in it. Why was he scared? Why was he so sure something would happen? He went over every possibility. Maybe someone cloned his voice. Maybe AI, maybe a prank. But how would they know what time he'd pick up? Why tell him not to leave? Why so specific? He thought about ignoring it. Getting dressed and going out anyway. Proving to himself it was nonsense. But what if it wasn't? What if, for some reason, this was real? He looked out the window. The street was quiet. Too quiet for a weekday morning. No school kids. No dogs barking. Just the wind rustling the leaves. His hand hovered over the doorknob. But he didn't turn it. Instead, he stepped back. And that's when he heard the sirens in the distance. His name was Mark. 34 years old. Quiet life, quiet habits. The kind of guy no one really noticed, and he liked it that way. He wasn't a risk-taker. He didn't chase adventures or believe in wild stories. His world was calm, controlled, predictable. Just the way he liked it. He worked from home as a freelance editor. Spent most of his day in front of a screen, trimming words, fixing grammar, sipping lukewarm coffee. He didn't mind it. No loud offices. No rush hour traffic. Just the soft click of keys and the occasional email. His apartment was small but neat. Everything had its place. The bookshelf organized by color. The couch always covered with the same gray blanket. One plant in the corner that he watered every Thursday. Even his mornings followed a pattern. Wake up at 7, check the news, drink coffee, start work by 8. Nothing ever changed. And maybe that's why the phone call hit him so hard. Because in a life that ran like clockwork, a voice telling him not to leave the house felt like someone had thrown a wrench into his gears. Mark wasn't the kind of person who believed in time travel or destiny or messages from the future. He believed in facts, logic, things that made sense. But this didn't make sense. And that made it worse. He didn't have many friends. Not the kind you call at 7 in the morning to say, "Hey, I think I just got a warning from my future self." What would they say anyway? Get some sleep? See a doctor? Even he wasn't sure, he didn't imagine it. But the call was real. He had proof. It was right there in the log. A timestamp. A voice he couldn't explain. Still, it was hard to accept. Because Mark knew himself. Knew that his imagination didn't run wild. He wasn't the type to get caught up in strange ideas. But here he was, questioning everything he believed about reality. He looked at his calendar. Nothing special about the day. Just bills to pay and groceries to grab. There was no reason this Thursday should be different from any other. And yet, he kept thinking about the voice. About how afraid it sounded. What would make him sound like that? He stood in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, staring at the tiled floor like it might give him answers. He replayed the call in his head, again and again, trying to catch something new. A clue. A hint. Anything. The voice had been rushed, tight with panic, but clear. There was no doubt in the message. Don't leave the house today, not maybe stay in, or be careful. It was an order. From himself. That was the part he couldn't shake. He tried to distract himself. Opened the fridge, made toast, fed the cat. Turned on a podcast. But everything felt wrong. Off. Like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what he'd do next. Mark wasn't used to being watched. He wasn't used to feeling important. But today felt different. Like his choices mattered more than they ever had. Maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, in the quiet part of his mind he usually ignored, something whispered. What if it's true? He didn't have the answer. But he was beginning to understand something else. This wasn't just about staying inside. It was about trust. And for the first time in his life, he had to decide whether he could trust himself. The call had lasted only seconds. But it echoed in Mark's mind like a siren. He could still hear the exact tone. That crack in the voice. That breathless urgency. It wasn't calm or curious. It was scared. And scared wasn't a word Mark normally connected with himself. He sat down on the edge of the couch, gripping the phone. His thumb hovered over the call history again. He stared at the unknown number. No digits, no location. Just that one word. And the time. 7:03 a.m. Something about that time kept bothering him. It was too precise. Almost like the call had been planned. Like it had to come before something happened. But what? He went to the kitchen and poured himself another cup of coffee. Hands slightly shaking. Not from the caffeine. From whatever was creeping under his skin. A feeling he couldn't name. Not fear exactly, but something close. A sense that the world had shifted a little. Like furniture, moved while he wasn't looking. He played the call again in his head. Over and over. Don't leave the house today. The voice hadn't introduced itself. Hadn't explained. Just gave the message and vanished. But it was enough. Enough to pull Mark out of routine. Enough to turn an ordinary Thursday into a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. What bothered him most wasn't that someone sounded like him. It was that it was him. He knew it. The way you know your own face in the mirror. There was no doubt. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't dreaming. That voice, that message, it was real. He tried to think logically. Could someone have recorded him speaking and played it back? Maybe edited a sentence together? But no one had access to his voice like that. He didn't post videos. Didn't do voice memos. Barely left voicemails. It wasn't possible. Unless it really was him. The idea seemed ridiculous, but so did everything else. How else could he explain it? A warning from the future? Time travel? Alternate realities? Things he used to laugh at in movies now sat quietly in the corner of his mind, not laughing at all. He opened his laptop. Search things like phone call from future self, and can your voice change with time? Dozens of conspiracy threads popped up. Forums full of people claiming strange experiences. He read one story about a man who saw his future reflection in a dream and avoided a fire the next day. Another post talked about hearing voices before accidents. Most of it felt like nonsense. But now he wasn't so sure. Mark closed the laptop. He didn't want stories. He wanted answers. And right now, the only thing he knew for certain was this. Something had tried to reach him. Something that sounded just like him. something that wanted to stop him from going outside. He stood up and walked to the window, pulled the curtain just slightly to peek out. The world looked the same. Cars moving, people walking, birds flying, nothing out of place. But that was the thing. Danger never announces itself. It waits in the background, quiet, patient. He paced for a few minutes, then sat again, turned on the TV just for the noise. But even the news anchor's voice felt distant, like it belonged to a different world, one that hadn't changed at 7:03 a.m. Mark glanced at the clock. It was 9:14 now, 2 hours since the call. He was still inside, still waiting, still wondering what, if anything, was about to happen. By mid-morning, Mark's nerves had settled just enough for him to think straight, but not enough to feel normal. He kept telling himself that if something bad was going to happen, it probably would have happened already. Maybe the voice was just a coincidence. Maybe he was overreacting. That's what he kept repeating in his head. But the feeling in his gut didn't agree. He glanced again at the front door. The lock was still bolted, the hallway silent. A small sliver of sunlight crept in from the window beside it. On any other day, he would have left by now. A short walk to the market, grab a sandwich at his usual spot, maybe even stop by the bookstore on the way back. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous. Just part of his simple, safe routine. But he hadn't even put on shoes today. He walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge again, not because he was hungry, but because it gave him something to do. The same containers stared back at him. Leftover pasta, half a lemon, a carton of eggs. Nothing he actually wanted to eat. He closed the door. There was an itch in his brain now, and no amount of pacing or snacking could scratch it. He couldn't work. He couldn't focus. All he could do was wait and wonder. What if he had left the house? What would have happened? Would it have been a random accident? Something small? Or something big? He thought about the way the voice had sounded, tight, frantic, like there wasn't time for details. Like it had been hard just to make the call. And then there was the question he hadn't let himself fully face yet. How did the voice get through? There'd been no message, no warning the day before. Nothing in his calendar, no strange dreams, no flashing lights or sudden power outages like you'd see in a sci-fi movie. Just that call, from a number that didn't exist. From a version of himself that maybe did. He sat back down at the table, picked up his phone again, and scrolled through the settings. He searched online for phone spoofing, time anomalies, anything that might explain what had happened. But every answer led to more questions. If it really was his future self, how far ahead was he? A day? A year? 10 years? And how had he done it? What made that future version so desperate that he had to reach back and stop something? Mark stood up and went to the window again. He saw an old woman walking her dog, a man pushing a stroller. Everything looked peaceful, ordinary, safe. And yet, none of it felt that way. Then something changed. A loud bang in the distance. Not too far. Not close either. The kind of sound that makes you pause and listen. A second later, the low, rising sound of sirens. Multiple ones. Not just an ambulance. Not just a fire truck. More. Mark leaned in, squinting. He saw smoke rising above the trees several blocks away. Thin at first, then thicker. Black. He turned on the news, flipping through channels, until he found a local report. A multi-car accident reported near East Pine and 7th Avenue. Officials are on the scene. No details yet, but eyewitnesses describe it as severe. Several vehicles involved. Mark blinked. East Pine and 7th. He knew that intersection. It was exactly where he would have been around this time. That's the street he took to get to the grocery store. That's the corner where the bus always stopped. He had walked it 100 times, never once thinking twice. But today, he wasn't there. The news report continued. Voices calm but urgent. Footage from a helicopter showed twisted metal, flashing lights, smoke pouring from the wreckage. Cars were piled against each other. Some turned sideways. One flipped entirely. A fire truck sprayed foam over the scene. An ambulance was already loading someone in on a stretcher. Mark sat motionless, eyes glued to the screen. The timestamp on the corner of the footage read 11:07 a.m. His chest tightened. That was exactly when he would have been passing through that intersection. Not maybe. Not probably. Exactly. His plan had been to leave the house at 10:30, walk to the market, and pass through that stretch of road. That was the route. That was the time. He watched as the camera zoomed in slightly. One of the vehicles was a dark gray sedan, the same model he used to drive before switching to walking everywhere. His mind began stitching together a version of the day that might have been him walking by, crossing the road, just at the wrong second. One of those cars spinning out of control. A crash. A sound. A moment that could have changed everything. He pulled his gaze from the screen and looked around his living room. Everything in its place. Still. Safe. Silent. And it hit him, not just what he avoided, but how close he had come to never knowing. If the call hadn't come. He rubbed his hands over his face. It felt like waking up from a dream you barely remember, but your heart still racing. The voice. That voice. His voice. It had known. Somehow. It had known, and it had reached out to stop it. And he had almost ignored it. What if he hadn't listened? What if he had brushed it off, laughed it away like he nearly did? What if he'd opened the door and just gone about his day like always? It was too much. He stood up, began pacing. The thought spiraled through his head like a tornado. The future, his future, had found a way to interfere. But why only this time? What made this day different? Was this a one-time thing? Or was there something else he didn't understand yet? He thought about how tired the voice had sounded. How scared. It wasn't just a warning, it was a plea. That was the difference. Not someone casually mentioning danger, but someone who had seen the result. Someone who lived through what he had just avoided. The voice wasn't asking for trust. It was begging. And somehow deep down he'd felt that. Mark sat back down and stared at his phone again. The call was still there in the history. Still no way to trace it. Still no way to call it back. It hadn't returned. No follow-up. No explanation. Just silence. The quiet felt heavier now, like the world had shifted around him and no one else noticed. He looked back at the TV. The camera had pulled away now, showing the blocked intersection from a wide angle. Police had set up a barrier. A fireman pointed at something off-screen. Behind them, someone stood with their hands on their head, staring into the wreckage. A bystander maybe, or someone who had just missed being part of it. Just like him. Mark felt something rise in his chest, not fear this time, but something stranger. A kind of awe, like standing too close to the edge of a cliff and realizing just how far the drop goes, and how close you came to falling. Mark didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling, the glow of his digital clock blinking in the darkness. Every time he closed his eyes, the crash replayed in his mind. Even though he hadn't seen it in person, he could feel it. The screech of tires, the crunch of metal, the thud of impact. His body reacted like he'd been there, like some part of him had lived through it already. Maybe he had. He thought about the voice again. Not just the words, but the way they had been spoken. Not rushed, but urgent. Not panicked, but desperate. And the more he replayed that tone in his mind, the more it felt like it had come from someone who had made a mistake before. Someone who had seen what happened the first time. What if that voice wasn't from his future anymore? What if it was from a version of him that didn't make it? A version that lived just long enough to figure out how to stop it from happening again? His mind spiraled, pulled deeper into thoughts he never used to entertain. Time loops. Alternate timelines. The possibility that his life split at 7:03 a.m. Two different paths, two different outcomes. One where he stepped out the door and never came back. And one where he stayed inside, heard the warning, and survived. And the more he thought about it, the more one strange question kept creeping in. Why him? Why had he been given a second chance? He wasn't anyone special. He didn't have some big mission in life, no world-changing purpose. He worked, paid bills, watered a plant. Why had the universe, or whatever force was behind that call, decided to save his life? The next morning felt different. Colder. Even the sunlight didn't land the same way across his kitchen counter. The coffee tasted flat. The hum of the refrigerator felt louder than usual. It was like everything was reminding him that the world had kept turning while he stayed frozen in a single choice. He picked up his phone again. No new calls. No messages. Nothing to explain what had happened. Just that one lonely entry in his history from the morning before. 7:03 a.m. unknown. He stared at it for a long time, not knowing what to expect. Would there be another call? Another warning? Or was that it? Part of him wanted to forget the whole thing. Pretend it never happened. Go back to normal, back to his routine. But something had shifted. The kind of shift you can't undo. Later that day, he stepped outside for the first time in 24 hours. Everything looked the same. Cars passed by. A kid rode a bike past him with a backpack swinging behind. Birds chirped from somewhere he couldn't see. But it didn't feel the same. He wasn't just walking through his neighborhood anymore. He was walking through the version of the world where he lived. The version where he listened. The version where he made it. He found himself scanning faces, watching people more closely. Not out of fear, but awareness. Like he was suddenly part of something bigger than he understood. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like every step mattered. Every small moment had weight. Because now he knew, the smallest warning can change everything. And sometimes, the voice that saves your life might just be your own. Mark never got another call like that again. Days passed. Then weeks. The memory didn't fade, but the sharpness dulled. Life moved on, as it always does. The world outside didn't change, but something in him did. He couldn't explain it, not to anyone else, and not even to himself in words that made sense. It was like waking up from a storm no one else heard. He went back to his routines, mostly. Coffee in the morning, emails in the afternoon, walks in the evening. But now, he paid attention to things he used to ignore. The way wind moved through tree branches. The rhythm of distant footsteps on pavement. How the sun shifted shadows across the walls during the day. He noticed patterns. He noticed pauses. He noticed silence. Every now and then, his eyes would drift to the phone. He never deleted that call. It sat in his log like a scar. A timestamp without a name. A moment when the world bent, just a little, and warned him not to step into the wrong version of his life. He thought about telling someone, a friend, a stranger, even anonymously on some message board. But every time he started, he stopped. Because how do you explain something like that without sounding unstable? My future self called and saved my life doesn't land well in conversation. So, he kept it to himself. But keeping it to himself didn't mean forgetting it. Sometimes at night, when the room was dark and quiet, he would sit up in bed and just listen. For what? He wasn't sure. Another call? A whisper from the future? Maybe just a feeling. That strange sense that something asterisk or someone asterisk was still watching over him from just out of sight. He started journaling again, not for clarity, but for record. Writing down the day's details. His thoughts. His choices. It wasn't about the past anymore, it was about the future. Just in case. If there was ever a reason to reach back again, he wanted to leave something behind. Something that might help. He often wondered what had to happen in that other version of his life to make that call necessary. What did that version of him go through? What did he lose? How bad did it get before he figured out how to stop it from happening again? He would never know. And maybe that was the point. The past wasn't supposed to be clear, and the future wasn't supposed to be predictable. But the present, that was something he could still choose. And now, he chose more carefully. Mark didn't become obsessed. He didn't build a bunker or cover his walls in red string. He lived. But he lived differently. He paid attention to gut feelings. He paused when something didn't feel right. He trusted the small things more. One evening, as he locked the front door and turned off the lights, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror across the room. Just for a second, he thought he looked older. Not in a tired way, but wiser. Like someone who'd seen both roads and quietly stepped onto the one that didn't lead to an end. He stood there, watching his reflection. The light from the hallway flickered. His own eyes stared back. Calm. Focused. And in that moment, he didn't feel alone. Because once, on a day that should have ended differently, a voice had told him to stay inside. And he had listened. Mark never got another call like that again. Days passed. Then weeks. The memory didn't fade, but the sharpness dulled. Life moved on, as it always does. The world outside didn't change, but something in him did. He couldn't explain it, not to anyone else, and not even to himself in words that made sense. It was like waking up from a storm no one else heard. He went back to his routines, mostly. Coffee in the morning, emails in the afternoon, walks in the evening. But now, he paid attention to things he used to ignore. The way wind moved through tree branches. The rhythm of distant footsteps on pavement. How the sun shifted shadows across the walls during the day. He noticed patterns. He noticed pauses. He noticed silence. Every now and then, his eyes would drift to the phone. He never deleted that call. It sat in his log like a scar. A timestamp without a name. A moment when the world bent, just a little, and warned him not to step into the wrong version of his life. He thought about telling someone, a friend, a stranger, even anonymously on some message board. But every time he started, he stopped. Because how do you explain something like that without sounding unstable? My future self called and saved my life doesn't land well in conversation. So, he kept it to himself. But keeping it to himself didn't mean forgetting it. Sometimes at night, when the room was dark and quiet, he would sit up in bed and just listen. For what? He wasn't sure. Another call? A whisper from the future? Maybe just a feeling. That strange sense that something asterisk or someone asterisk was still watching over him from just out of sight. He started journaling again, not for clarity, but for record. Writing down the day's details. His thoughts. His choices. It wasn't about the past anymore, it was about the future. Just in case. If there was ever a reason to reach back again, he wanted to leave something behind. Something that might help. He often wondered what had to happen in that other version of his life to make that call necessary. What did that version of him go through? What did he lose? How bad did it get before he figured out how to stop it from happening again? He would never know. And maybe that was the point. The past wasn't supposed to be clear, and the future wasn't supposed to be predictable. But the present, that was something he could still choose. And now, he chose more carefully. Mark didn't become obsessed. He didn't build a bunker or cover his walls in red string. He lived. But he lived differently. He paid attention to gut feelings. He paused when something didn't feel right. He trusted the small things more. One evening, as he locked the front door and turned off the lights, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror across the room. Just for a second, he thought he looked older. Not in a tired way, but wiser. Like someone who'd seen both roads and quietly stepped onto the one that didn't lead to an end. He stood there, watching his reflection. The light from the hallway flickered. His own eyes stared back. Calm. Focused. And in that moment, he didn't feel alone. Because once, on a day that should have ended differently, a voice had told him to stay inside. And he had listened.